Imagine disappearing without a trace. Your name enters police records. Years pass, then decades. Eventually, investigators begin to believe they may have found you. But there is one terrible problem. The woman they found is dead. For years, detectives build a case around the possibility that an unidentified murder victim, discovered in Colorado in 1954, was actually a missing woman named Katharine Farrand Dyer. The timing seemed right.
Her disappearance seemed to fit. Even modern forensic comparison techniques could not immediately rule her out. Then, more than half a century after Katharine vanished, investigators received information that destroyed their entire theory. Katharine Dyer was not dead. She wasn't buried in Colorado. She wasn't even in the United States. She was approximately 8,000 miles away, living in Australia, and she had apparently been there for decades. So how does a woman disappear from America in 1954, remain effectively lost to investigators for 55 years, become a potential murder victim, and then suddenly turn up alive on the other side of the world?
And, perhaps even more remarkably, finding Katharine alive would eventually help investigators uncover the real identity of the woman lying in that Colorado grave. This is the extraordinary case of Katharine Farrand Dyer. Our story begins in Denver, Colorado. According to the surviving missing person information, Katharine E. Dyer disappeared on March 26, 1954. The Charlie Project currently lists her as having been 27 years old when she disappeared. Although historical sources contain conflicting information about her age and birth details, that disagreement will become important later. What is certain is that Katharine vanished from Denver. And remember the period we are talking about. This was 1954. There was no internet, no social media, no searchable nationwide digital missing person database.
No instant sharing of photographs between police departments around the country. In fact, the FBI's National Crime Information Center, the computerized system known as NSIC, would not become operational until 1967, 13 years after Katharine disappeared.
If an adult moved from one city to another, changed a name, stopped communicating with certain people, or simply started again somewhere else, tracking that person could be extraordinarily difficult. Katharine's disappearance might have remained just another old missing person mystery, except something happened less than 2 weeks later. Something horrifying.
On April 8, 1954, an unidentified young woman's body was discovered in Boulder Canyon, not far from Denver. Investigators knew she had been murdered, but they did not know her name. For decades, she became known simply as Boulder Jane Doe. Think about those two dates. Katharine Dyer disappears from Denver in late March. Then, on April 8th, an unidentified murdered woman is discovered in the same general region of Colorado.
Naturally, decades later, investigators looking again at the old case would ask an obvious question. Could the dead woman be Katharine? But at the time, investigators could not simply type Katharine's name into a nationwide computer and compare the records.
According to a later account of the investigation, many of the original agency records had eventually been lost or destroyed. Researchers trying to reconstruct what happened had to use old newspaper reports and surviving historical material. That created a dangerous information gap. Katharine had disappeared. Nobody investigating the Jane Doe case could establish conclusively what had happened to her, and no one could prove that the unidentified victim was someone else. The possibility remained alive. An unidentified woman remained buried without her real name for decades. But one person became determined to change that. Colorado historian and researcher Sylvia Pettam became deeply involved in the Boulder Jane Doe mystery. Her work eventually developed into a collaboration with the Boulder County Sheriff's Office and forensic specialists. In 2004, authorities reopened the cold case. Now investigators had tools that detectives in 1954 could scarcely have imagined.
DNA analysis, forensic anthropology, facial reconstruction, digital research, internet databases, historical genealogy, and photo comparison technology.
The objective was simple to describe, but extremely difficult to achieve. Give Jane Doe her name back. Investigators considered numerous missing women and eliminated candidates one after another. Eventually, attention focused heavily on Katharine Farrand Dyer. She had disappeared shortly before Jane Doe was discovered. Her whereabouts remained unknown, and surviving information created enough similarities to make investigators take the theory seriously. This is where the case becomes especially fascinating. Investigators were not simply guessing that Jane Doe might be Katharine. They began accumulating circumstantial evidence. Researchers tried locating Katharine's relatives so DNA could be compared with DNA obtained from Jane Doe. But initially, they could not find the relatives they needed. Then, another method was attempted. A photograph of Katharine was compared with the physical reconstruction of Jane Doe. According to an investigative account published in 2010, photo superimposition techniques failed to exclude Katharine. That does not mean the technique proved that Katharine was Jane Doe. This distinction is crucial. It meant investigators could not rule her out. And when investigating a mystery in which nearly every other candidate has been eliminated, a person who cannot be excluded becomes extremely important. The circumstantial case grew stronger. Katharine was missing. The dates fit closely. The location was plausible. The physical comparison did not eliminate her, and investigators still could not find convincing evidence that Katharine had lived beyond 1954. For a time, the theory looked remarkably strong. But investigators were about to learn one of the greatest lessons in cold case history. Evidence that supports a theory is not the same as proof of a theory. Now move forward to the summer of 2009. Katharine had been gone for approximately 55 years. She had become one of the strongest candidates for the identity of Boulder Jane Doe. Investigators had spent enormous time trying to trace her. Then something almost absurdly simple happened. No secret police operation. No dramatic DNA database hit. No international manhunt. An address book was found. According to the Boulder County Sheriff's account, later reproduced in the Chesapeake Examiner, a caretaker in Australia discovered an address book among an elderly woman's belongings. A name connected with Katharine was searched on the internet, and that search led back toward the people investigating the Colorado case.
Suddenly, investigators were confronting an extraordinary possibility. The elderly woman in Australia might actually be the supposedly missing Katharine Farrand Dyer. On August 20th, 2009, the Boulder County Sheriff publicly announced what it described as a good news, bad news development. The good news? The woman investigators had been searching for was alive. The bad news? She was not Boulder Jane Doe. Their strongest identification theory had just collapsed. The woman located in Queensland, Australia, was approximately 84 years old. She was Katharine Farrand Dyer, alive, more than 5 decades after her 1954 disappearance.
Associated Press reporting at the time confirmed that Boulder County investigators announced they had located the woman they considered the most likely candidate for Jane Doe. For detectives, it must have been an astonishing moment.
Imagine spending years attempting to determine whether a missing woman had been murdered, only to discover that she had been living a completely different life, thousands of miles away. This was not a case where someone had survived secretly for a few months.
Katharine had built decades of life, beyond the point where American records had effectively lost her. One investigative account states that, after difficulties in her earlier life, including a failed marriage and the death of a child in a vehicle accident, Katharine eventually joined an all-woman yacht crew and sailed to Australia.
There, she later remarried and settled down. That account also says her biographical information was more complicated than investigators initially believed, including discrepancies surrounding her original birth information and the name by which she had become known. Those complications help explain why ordinary record searches failed.
This is probably the biggest question viewers will have. How could Katharine possibly remain a missing person for so long? The answer is that the word missing does not always mean the person themselves does not know where they are. Sometimes it means the people searching for them cannot establish where they went. The circumstances of 1954 made that problem much greater. When Katharine disappeared, police agencies did not have a national computerized network containing modern missing person records. Her case would have depended heavily on local information, telephone calls, letters, paper files, and newspaper circulation. The later investigation specifically noted that missing person cases in that period were commonly circulated at the local and regional level. The FBI's ENIAC computerized information system would only launch in 1967. Now add another complication. According to the later investigation, when Katharine's family was eventually located, they apparently did not even know that she had once been officially reported missing. They had lost contact with her for a period. But from their perspective, this was not necessarily the same mystery police investigators believed they were trying to solve. That distinction is enormous. Investigators had one version of Katharine's story. Her relatives had another. Katharine herself had lived an entirely different continuation of it. And there was no modern information network connecting all three. There is another detail worth explaining, because it demonstrates why old cases must be handled carefully. The Charlie Project lists Katharine as 27 years old at the time of her March 1954 disappearance. Yet the Boulder County Sheriff's 2009 announcement described her as 84 when she was located.
Those numbers do not perfectly align, but the historical investigation itself states
that Katharine's date and place of birth were not what investigators had previously believed. In other words, the discrepancy is not something that should simply be hidden.
It is part of the story. Cold cases frequently contain conflicting dates, misspellings, aliases, incorrect ages, and incomplete records. A responsible retelling should distinguish between confirmed evidence and details that remain uncertain. The important fact is not whether every early record had Katharine's age correct. The important fact is that the woman reported missing from Denver in March 1954 was ultimately located alive in Australia in 2009.
Katharine's discovery solved one mystery, but it immediately resurrected another. If Boulder Jane Doe wasn't Katharine, who was she? For investigators, finding Katharine alive meant returning almost completely to the beginning.
But sometimes, an apparent setback becomes the event that solves a case. Publicity surrounding Katharine's discovery spread. People who had previously dismissed the possibility that Jane Doe could be their missing relative suddenly had reason to reconsider.
And on the night of September 27, 2009, historian Sylvia Pedham received a message. The sender believed Jane Doe might be her great-aunt. The missing woman was named Dorothy Gay Howard.
Dorothy's characteristics produced several striking similarities. She was approximately the appropriate age. She had the right general physical build. Her teeth reportedly had no fillings.
And she had an appendectomy scar, matching an important characteristic of Jane Doe. This time, investigators had something they could not obtain in the Katharine theory: a living close relative willing to provide DNA.
Dorothy Howard's surviving sister provided a cheek swab. Investigators compared her mitochondrial DNA with a DNA profile previously obtained from Jane Doe. The result was the breakthrough investigators had waited more than half a century to see. They matched.
On October 28, 2009, the Boulder County Sheriff's Office announced that Boulder Jane Doe had finally been identified. Her name was Dorothy Gay Howard. She had been only about 18 years old when she died. For 55 years, Dorothy had rested under a name that wasn't hers.
Katharine Dyer, ironically, had almost become that name. Instead, discovering Katharine alive created the opening that helped Dorothy's family recognize the possibility that Jane Doe was their missing relative. One missing woman's rediscovery helped another missing woman finally be identified. And this is where we need to separate the incredible story from exaggeration. Katharine Dyer was not proven murdered and then somehow discovered alive. Rather, she disappeared in 1954. Decades later, investigators came to believe she was a strong candidate for an unidentified murder victim. Circumstantial evidence supported that possibility, but there was never conclusive proof. Then, in 2009, Katharine herself was located alive in Australia, definitively eliminating her as Jane Doe. That difference matters. True crime stories often become distorted as they are retold. A theory becomes a fact. A possibility becomes a certainty. A person police could not exclude becomes someone police positively identified. That is not what happened here. The evidence demonstrates something more interesting.
Investigators constructed a reasonable theory from the limited information available. Then new evidence proved that theory wrong, and instead of forcing the evidence to fit their original belief, they abandoned the theory. That is exactly what good investigation requires.
Katharine's story is also remarkable for another reason. To investigators in America, she was frozen in 1954. A missing woman, a photograph, a name in an old record, a possible murder victim. But Katharine's life had not stopped in 1954. She traveled. She crossed oceans. According to the later investigative account, she sailed with an all-woman crew. She reached Australia. She remarried. She built another life. Years became decades. While investigators in Colorado looked backward, trying to establish whether she had died, Katharine had continued moving forward. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of this entire case. Behind every missing person poster is a human being whose life may be far more complicated than the surviving paperwork suggests.
Sometimes the ending is tragic. Sometimes there is never an ending at all. And very rarely, after more than half a century, the answer comes from thousands of miles away. She's alive.
On March 26, 1954, Katharine Farrand Dyer disappeared from Denver. In April of that year, another young woman was found murdered in Boulder Canyon. Decades later, modern investigators connected those two events and seriously considered whether the woman in the grave was Katharine. Forensic comparisons could not initially eliminate her. Old records offered few answers. Her relatives were difficult to trace. Then an address book, an internet search, and a caretaker, thousands of miles away, changed everything.
In 2009, Katharine was found alive in Queensland, Australia. The discovery proved investigators' strongest theory wrong. But strangely, that failure helped produce success. Renewed publicity encouraged Dorothy Gay Howard's family to step forward. DNA gave Jane Doe her name back, and two mysteries that had become entangled for decades were finally separated. Katharine was alive. Jane Doe was Dorothy, and history had been corrected.
So the next time you hear about a person who vanished decades ago, remember this case. Missing does not automatically mean murdered. No body should be identified through resemblance alone. Circumstantial evidence can build a powerful theory, but it cannot replace proof. And sometimes, the smallest object imaginable, an old address book, can solve a mystery that survived for 55 years. Katharine Farrand Dyer had disappeared from America's records, but she had never disappeared from the world. And when investigators finally found her, she wasn't lying beneath a gravestone in Colorado. She was alive, on the other side of the planet.